Well, good day and welcome to SOP Save Our Planet. My name is Gary Willing. I hope you're having a wonderful September the 27th. Or if you're listening to this video on another day, and that's fine, hope you're having a great day wherever and whenever you're listening to this video. Now, I always like to do a couple things before I get going, and the first thing is the most important thing that I think anyone should do upon listening to this information, especially for the first time, is to do some research for yourself. Look into it, see if it's true for you. If you check out the information on some of these websites that I provided links for, and all those links are in the description portion of these videos, you can get some really good background information about what I'm talking about to see if what I'm saying is true for you or not. I will be completely satisfied with whatever the result is, but I am really hoping and encouraging you to take the time to look into this information and investigate it for yourself. The second thing that I'm hoping that you do, it's not as important as the first thing, is to join the discussion. Let me know what you think. Post a comment. And then a lot of times, like I'm going to do today, I'm going to address some of the comments that I got. I didn't get any questions, but I'm going to talk about some of the comments because I like to put these videos up and I like to talk about different stuff, and you guys help me do this. So post a comment. Let me know what you think. If you have a question you want to ask me, post your question in the comment section. I'll also try to answer it in the next video, or email me, searchforsigns@mail.com. All right. And again, I really appreciate everybody that commented, and you guys all gave me some wonderful comments to think about and discuss here. So let's see. Where is it? Oh, here it is. I'll start with this one first. Non-dual minds transcend dichotomies. They are in the world, but not of the world. They give unto Caesar what is his, but realize how vaporous and temporal is. How vaporous the temporal is. And how that statement is true, but doesn't it sound like a haiku? We're both trying to be poetic here. No, I really see where you're coming from, and I want to talk about this because we can expound upon it and perhaps learn some thing or two about this stuff. First thing, when it comes to the mind, what Krishnamurti would say is the mind is dual in nature, right? You can't have a mind that isn't. The key is, and I think you're doing this, it's just the way that it's worded, right? And this is what I wanted to talk about too, is you have to detach yourself from identifying as that duality, which is not the mind. The mind doesn't detach. The self detaches from its manifestation in that way. And so when you no longer identify with the mind, you no longer identify with the duality, right? Which I guess is a different way of explaining what you're stating. But it's so true, right? Now, the other thing too about being in the world and not of the world, right? Maitreya says that the self alone matters. And what is the self? And he also said that he comes to teach humanity the art of self-realization. But what is this self and how do we realize it, right? Well, the self is the truth of life. There is nothing but the self everywhere. That is what religion is trying to explain is God, but they're explaining it in terms of an ideology. But the self is everywhere. We live and move and have our being in the self. So, for instance, and I'm going to give you an example to help explain it. Let's say there's this piece of property in your town. Right? It's undeveloped. It's got trees everywhere, right? And then here comes a construction company, and they come and they tear down all the trees and they flatten the earth, and then they build a non-denominational evangelical church there. And it's nice. And people come there and worship. And they sing songs about Jesus where there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not making fun of it. I'm just saying this to say this is going on. And they're praising Jesus, and they all, speak in the way that they speak, and they do what they do, right? Did anything change to the space that had even the trees there before that church was built? Did anything change to the space there? Or is that space permanent? Well, that's why Maitreya says the self is permanent. It's in itself is permanent. That's why they also call it the absolute reality. There is nothing changing with the self. Consciousness changes. Our physicality changes, but the self in and of itself is unchanged. So with this same scenario, okay, so it was an undeveloped land. They tore it down. They built this evangelical church. And then the elders of that church spot another piece of property that they want to build a bigger church in. So then they sell that property off, and then it's torn down, and they build a mosque there. Now, people who practice Islam go to this same spot on the same piece of property. The building looks different. They have different pictures and artifacts in there. They speak in a different way. They worship a different God, and I'm putting a different God in quotations. What happened to the space that was there when the trees were there, and then they tore the trees down and built the evangelical church, and then they tore that down and built the mosque? What happened to the space? Was that space changed at all? Was it affected at all? Well, it didn't, obviously, right? And then the next question would be is, where does that space stop? Does it stop at the end of the property and then there's another space? Or does that space really go and extend as far as we could possibly even think that it extends to, right? Another way of saying it is how Carl Sagan said it. Without the universe, you can't even bake a cake in your oven. It's all the same thing. So what we see in our own life, we think is separate. We call it our life, we call it our home or our job or our car or our kids, is all a part of the same universe that is there, that is massive in scale compared to what we can see, and is happening and moving, but yet not affecting that space that allows it to exist. So how do we realize ourselves as this self? If this is truly who we are? And Maitreya says it's honesty of mind, sincerity of spirit, and detachment. We all think one thing, say something else, and do something entirely different. We need to have all of what we think and what we say and what we do all line up. It's really true integrity. But that would be different for you than it is for me. We have to be our own person. We can't be somebody else. We can't even follow somebody else, because when we follow somebody else, we don't practice honesty of mind. That's why Maitreya doesn't come to create followers. For that very reason, because it doesn't lead you to the self. It just leads you to more ideology, more confusion, more frustration, more anxiety, more competition and greed. And when you realize yourself as the self, none of that can exist, really, truly. And then the next thing he would say to practice is sincerity of spirit. This, of course, looks different for you than it would for me, but the same process would be the same, which is, in a word, you become decentralized. You're no longer focused on the point that you call yourself, which is the person, or the man or woman in incarnation. And this happens in moments in our life. The masters experience this 100% of the time. But moments in our life where you could experience yourself as the self with sincerity of spirit would be sitting on a beach, like Maitreya says it, right? He says, when you sit on a beach, it's very easy because you are looking out into this void of, the ocean. You see the horizon. The sun's going down, and you forget all about your cares in the world. That's why people love to go to the beach, for that reason, because you forget about your life for that time where you're there. And you're just enjoying the moment. You can get it when you're having a conversation with somebody that you love, and you have this heart-to-heart conversation, and you forget all about everything, and time just slips away, and you're just enjoying the conversation. I also think you can do it while you're serving, of course, because this is the reason why the masters encourage all of us to serve in some level, because when you serve, you become decentralized. You're forgetting about your own little petty little self, and you focus on other people, and it changes your perspective on things. And there's other ways to do it too, but you get my point. So, honesty of mind, think the same thing as you do, or say the same thing as you do. Have it all line up. Don't follow others for that very reason. Same thing with the sincerity of spirit. Be in the moment, and those kind of things. And then detachment. We all identify with everything that is not us. Just the fact that you can see it means that it is not you. We identify with our thoughts as us, our emotions as us. We say that this is us and we own this, when actually we don't. We're just witnessing it. It would be the same as that house, right? I mean, you dress the house up, you decorate it, you furnish the house, but the house isn't you, right? So just Just because you're living within the house doesn't mean that house is you. So even if you left and a tornado ripped the house up and destroyed the house, and you went back to that spot, you're still there. The house isn't, but you're still there. It's the same principle. But those three things are not things that you can intellectualize or philosophize on, that you have to practice it. And then practice it again. And fail, and practice and fail. And because we are not masters, we can't do this perfectly. We can only do it at moments in our life. But it can become habitual to where you're trying it. And then eventually what happens is you do it perfectly all 100% of the time, and you become a master. That's the whole point. It will be easier when we see Maitreya and see these other masters and see how to truly live with honesty of mind, sincerity of spirit, and detachment. Because that's how and who and what they are, and who and what they identify with. But anyway, hopefully that helps. But thank you very much for the comment. Okie dokie. Now, there was a couple comments that I wanted to discuss here before we finish, but they're very long, so I'll just read a bit of it, and then we'll get the idea of what they're saying, and we'll talk about it. So, the Marshall Plan was incredible for rebuilding Europe, no doubt. But it wasn't a magic bullet, and it wasn't perfect. It tied Europe tightly to American money and politics, pushed a very specific economic model, and actually deepened the Cold War by splitting East and West even further. It helped some countries more than others, and created a long-term dependence on U.S. power. Okay. Well, for one thing, I never said that the Marshall Plan was perfect. For one thing, it didn't last very long. It would have been better if it had lasted, and kept going, right? And it would have been way better if it had been tried amongst every nation and not just those, right? But what I'm saying, and like I said, I never said the Marshall Plan was perfect. I just said it was a form of the principle of sharing. It might not have been the intention of George C. Marshall even to do it as a principle of sharing. But according to the masters, it was the first and only time that the principle of sharing was tried. Because it took excesses from the United States and gave it to Europe, and then they paid back what they took by their excesses of resources, which is what the principle of sharing is. That's all it is. But it also, it's true to say, because if you go and do the research on the Marshall Plan, all the nations that participated in the Marshall Plan were at one time at war with one another. And up until recently, before the Marshall Plan, we had World War I and World War II for sure. So, and Europe was engulfed in war, right? But since then, none of them have attacked one another, which is the outcome of the principle of sharing, which is a little bit of goodwill. And I've always said it like that. I never said it was perfect peace. I just said it was a little bit of goodwill that was created, but by that principle of sharing being done. It was also, according to the Master DK, the only time that the soul quality of the United States, which is love, because it's on the love wisdom ray, had manifest for that time. Since then and before then, it was always the personality of the United States that was manifested. And until the United States does the principle of sharing again, the soul quality of this country won't manifest yet. So, but I think a couple things that when we look back at this historically, we will see that the Marshall Plan was absolutely necessary in order for our own survival. Because according to Maitreya, without sharing, there will be no justice. Without justice, there will be no peace. And without peace, there will be no future. But when we won't come to that realization until the day of declaration, when Maitreya presents in front of humanity a choice. Do we continue on in the ways that we're doing, right? And eventually at some point, we will destroy ourselves. All life on planet Earth will be destroyed if we continue on in the way that we're doing. Or try the principle of sharing and see what happens. And then that would give us a future, bring about peace, eventually manifested love and unity on this planet. And we will see both outcomes on the day of declaration because Maitreya will give us a vision of both outcomes. Now, the thing that we'll look back on with the Marshall Plan, because I think after the day of declaration, Maitreya probably will present that as historical evidence of what he's saying to be true, that the principle of sharing will bring about goodwill amongst nations. Because it did. It wasn't a perfect peace. It was the lowest aspect of love from the Master's point of view, which is goodwill. It did bring it about because those nations have not attacked one another since then. the peoples of those nations that participated in the Marshall Plan trust one another and have remained trusting in a way. Not perfect, never said it was perfect, but have trusted better than they would have, I think, before the Marshall Plan took place after World War II. The other thing that's going to be looked at when it comes to the Marshall Plan was it fulfilled 2 out of the 3 requirements that were needed for Maitreya to see that humanity was ready for himself and these masters to come back into the everyday world. The first one being a measure of peace had to have been established, which it can be said is true. It's not perfect, but there is a measure of peace. Even if you look at the map, right? The borders of nations have stabilized for the most part. Yes, there have been attacks. Yes, there have been different things here. But by and large, if you look at the map of the world, the borders of nations have stabilized. So there's been a measure of peace that was established after World War II. And the Marshall Plan was a part of it, even though it was just with these little bit of nations. The other thing was that the principle of sharing had to start to at least govern the minds of the world leaders of the time. And then the third thing, which I don't think the Marshall Plan really proved to Maitreya that we were ready, but it was a requirement that must have been fulfilled on some level, is the political parties had to start to clean up the corruption. And he said he would not be able to come back unless humanity started to do those 3 things. So I do think it will be looked at historically that the Marshall Plan fulfilled at least 2 out of the 3 of those things, which allowed him to come back in the everyday world, which will eventually give us a future, because I don't think we stand a chance unless Maitreya is out in the everyday world along with these masters teaching humanity and then showing us and galvanizing us for change and so forth. Now then, when you talked about the other thing in terms of the Pax Americana policy, I don't think that the Marshall Plan was responsible for that. I think that was the nefarious work and activity of the Dark Lords through the Pentagon that created the buildup with the Cold War. And the Soviet Union saw that they had to try to match it for their own survival because they were feeling deeply threatened by the military buildup here in the United States and with NATO and so forth. I also don't think that, and this is just my guess, I could be wrong, I don't think that the United States is selfless enough as a culture, as a people, to be the first to offer up their resources to another nation in this way. They had their chance, they did it, we did it a little bit, but I don't think we're going to do it until we see other nations doing it, and we're going to be okay. Right? So I do think that, this is just a guess, it could be a nation like Japan that starts it. I know everybody in the United States thinks that they're going to be the first to do everything, but I don't think the United States is going to be the first. I think it will be a country like Japan or England that will start it. But Japan has a tremendous ability for self-sacrifice. This is one of the qualities of their people. They also have a tremendous spirituality that if you really can't describe it because they're very modern and they have all the problems of a modern society, but yet they're very deeply spiritual and connected in a way. I can't, like I said, I can't describe it. You just have to go there and see it for yourself. They're the way that they are about it, but their ability for self-sacrifice is, I think, something that could lead them to be a candidate for a nation that tries the principle of sharing first. So I could be wrong, but that's just what I'm thinking. But the reason why every other option has been tried to bring about peace for the world and has failed because we haven't tried the principle of sharing for real. So even though we did it just during the Marshall Plan, it really wasn't enough to create world peace, of course, right? Because we didn't do it with every nation. But everything that we've done since then, every foreign policy that the United States has tried and has promised to bring about peace, just like they're doing today, will never bring about peace because it's never brought about peace. The masters will tell you that sharing is the only way, the only way to bring about peace. And like I've always said, is it, the humanity has never right out the bat gotten it right on anything, right? It's just a personal experience, right? So when offered the suggestion by Maitreya to try the principle of sharing, are we going to do exactly what he says perfectly? Probably not. There's always going to be some somebody in the room that's going to say, let's try it this way, you know, and we'll be at least moving in the right direction, you know, and trying different. And I think Ben's master even said that different viewpoints will be tried and to see if that will work and be efficient in terms of the principle of sharing. But eventually we'll ask them, like, maybe it will even be after we tried and failed a few times, you know, to try the principle of sharing our own way and perhaps do it how we did it during the Marshall Plan, you know. But the most efficient way that the masters will say is for the principle of sharing to take place is to create a department in the United Nations that its sole purpose is to do the principle of sharing. And it will start with nations making an inventory of what they have in excess and then also an inventory of what they need. And then when it's put forth to this department in the United Nations, headed up by a master, they will start to be able to very easily schlep resources from one nation to another. And then the principle of sharing will start. And just how it created goodwill amongst the nations that participated in the Marshall Plan, it will start to bring about goodwill and a little bit of trust between nations. And then eventually, as we do it more and more and more, we'll start to trust each other. And then eventually, all the barriers of trade and interchanges of people will just fall away, because this is one of the other priorities of Maitreya. I never talk about it because it's, you know, a ways down the road. But eventually, we won't even need passports to go from one country to another. We can just travel and see it. It'll be free, you know, without any restrictions, without any visas. But we have to have trust, right? But in the interim, it will at least give us enough trust amongst nations to try to solve the problem of the environment, which is the single biggest problem that we're facing right now, is the environmental problem. So hopefully that adds to it, but thank you very much for the comment. All right, now lastly, as one who would label himself a former lifelong progressive, the past 10 years have been very disheartening seeing progressive people, and you put progressive in quotation marks both times, and politicians act incredibly close-minded, hateful, and unhinged as a result of their intense hatred of Trump. It seems like he's a lightning rod for shadow projection from those who strongly dislike him. The hypocrisy and dishonesty of the past 10 years has been mind-blowing for me, and to my mind, has done the cause of justice they claim to speak up for far more damage than any usual conservative pushback. I have been heartened by many of the conservatives loudly pushing back against war and its horrors, and pushing for focusing on cleaning our own house here in America. Of course, and I'll leave it at this last little bit. Of course, the conservatives have their own kind of hypocrisy. Oh yeah, they do. And both sides are hypocrites, you know, really. And both sides are corrupt. You know, I would suggest, if I were to make a suggestion, is for anybody, don't label yourself as a progressive or a conservative. Because there really is, in truth, there is no true progressive or true conservative, really. And I'll give you an example, right? So a company wants to go in and just level a forest to build a community or an office park or whatever. And the environmentalists are saying, no, don't cut down the trees. Well, who's the conservative in that scenario, and who's the true liberal, right? A conservative and conservative are almost the same. They're coming from the same Latin derivative, right? So in that case, the person who's the environmentalist is the conservative, really, you know, if you look at it. So when you label yourself as one thing or another, it makes it very, very difficult to see the other person's perspective. You have to step over a barrier to go to the other side and see the other side. If you don't align yourself with any, it's very easy, you know. I remember years upon years ago, and this was back, probably 2004, 2005 maybe. I took a road trip with my brother up to Michigan, who's a die-in-the-wool Republican. And of course, we started talking about politics, and it started to get kind of heated a little bit. And he tried to goat me and to trigger my emotions by talking about some of the illegalities that he had heard with Hillary Clinton. And I didn't mean to shut him down, because I was speaking honestly, I'm not a Hillary Clinton fan, and it really shut him down. And when I said, if she did something illegal that she should go to jail for, she should go to jail for it, because nobody's above the law. And then I said, and then we started talking about it. He kept trying to goat me into more and more about Hillary and the Bill Clinton and this, that, and the other. And I said, yeah, Bill Clinton did something. Send him to jail, right? If that's the case. But can you say the same thing about the people that you look up to on your political side, right? And he couldn't. He literally could not say it. I said, well, Ron, we'll even say it together. I'll say Hillary, you say George W. Bush. He could not say if George W. Bush did something illegal, he should go to jail. Couldn't say it. Because he was so ingrained in the ideological view of republicanism that he could not say it. So even now, when you listen to people on the news, those, when you get a left-winger on there, they'll say, hey, if Obama did something illegal, send him to jail. And Obama did do things that were unconstitutional, for sure. One of them is he bombed somebody that he knew. There was a U.S. citizen who was labeled as a terrorist, right? That person did not get due process. The President of the United States usurped the courts and killed him. Unconstitutional, right? And if we could try our presidents for what they do while they're president, well, then he should go to jail for it, for sure. We're not, but I mean, you know what I'm saying. I mean, but it's very easy for me to say that. Why can't they say the same thing about Trump? I don't know. Because they're so locked up and locked into what they're saying, hook, line, and sinker, that they cannot see the forest for the trees. But these divisions are necessary. I know it's painful in the extreme, because it's painful in the extreme for me to live through this period too. But Ben's master said, it's absolutely essential that we are divided as a species. Right, left, environmentalist conservatives to those, the capitalists who want to just tear down the trees for whatever purpose, I'm trying to think some other ones, racial divisions, economic divisions, national divisions. The reason why we are divided like this is so that when Maitreya presents the choice to humanity, we will be able to make the right choice. That's why we are divided the way that we are. So it is absolutely necessary. And the extremes that you're seeing, which you're talking about the extremes, right, don't represent the entire left, just as the extremes on the right don't represent the most of the people on the right. It's just those are the people that are getting the most press. You know what I mean? So, but they're, I don't agree with the extreme leftism, like I was talking about in the last video. I mean, the thought of throwing tomato soup on the Mona Lisa to bring awareness of the environmental problem. Why are you doing that, right? It makes no sense to me to do that. And my daughter, and this is an example of not labeling yourself as a leftist or a rightist, Democrat or Republican or anything, is I think it's important for parents not to impose their beliefs on their kids. I know other people would disagree with that, but my daughter, I've never once had a conversation with my daughter about Maitreya. Never, not once. And it's not because I'm scared to talk to her about it. You can see I talk about Maitreya all the time in these videos. Why couldn't I talk to my own daughter about it? It's just, I want her to come to the realization of the truth for her, whatever that is, not me telling her what is true. And she's seen my books lying around. She knows she's probably taken time to Google it, and she's never thought to even ask me a question. So till she does, I won't say anything. And even politically, I've never imposed my political will on her or said what I thought to be the best way politically to believe. And when she was young, and she's still young, but when she was younger and she started talking about politics, really uninvited, she sounded more like a right-winger than a left-winger, for sure. And then she started to hang around with some people in high school who were very left-leaning. And some of the things that come out of her mouth, I totally disagree with. And the times that we do talk about it, most of the time I'm saying that's not true. I'm thinking to myself, what she's saying, I don't agree with. You know what I'm saying? Even though she's very much on the left. One of the ones, and I'll give you an example, is systemic racism. I'm a Caucasian, she's Asian. And she said to me that if you're a white, you're a racist. And you should feel bad about slavery. And I do feel bad about slavery, but I was never a slave owner, right? So, and my family was never owned slaves. So why should I be held accountable for something that I didn't do or any of my family did? What's the point of that? Half my family was in Europe during the time of slavery in the United States, and the other half lived in the North. So, I don't agree with systemic racism. I think that there's no truth to that. But what do I know? You know what I'm saying? But I've never told her that she was wrong. I just presented my side of it. She's old enough now; she can have her own opinions, right? So I don't agree with everything that the left says either way. And I know you're not saying this about me, but I'm just saying this in general. It's best not to align yourself with either side. The thing that I was saying is certain people in the media and certain people in the government who I would have never expected are starting to speak out against an injustice, just one, or maybe two with the Epstein files, right? But with what's going on in Palestine, with the genocide in Palestine, they're speaking out against it. And these are people who typically would not speak out against that kind of injustice because they didn't care if there was an injustice perpetrated on someone else, only if it was perpetrated on them. And if you look 20 years ago, those same people who are speaking out now against what's going on in Palestine relished the attack in Iraq. They loved it. And they talked about how great it was that we were doing this. But now they're starting to see that this is a problem. And they're speaking out against it. And I think it's not indicative of them changing their political minds or becoming left-wing or, going against the Republican line per se. It's just their heart is starting to open up ever so slightly to the concerns and needs of someone else that's different than them, that speaks a different language, that has a different colored skin, that worships a different God. And they're starting to say that these people should be treated with dignity too. And they should have a right to live and govern themselves and not be, persecuted or erased, as they're doing, right? And they're horrified by what the Zionists are doing to them. And the other thing that I've noticed is that those very same people have been going on left-wing shows, and the left-wing shows that I listen to have been going on right-wing shows, and there's a little bit more of a commonality. And they always preface it by saying, I don't agree with everything that the other person's saying, right? Well, when's the last time you agree with anything that anybody said 100% of the time, right? We don't. We're starting to realize that we actually have the ability to think for ourselves, right? Now, political parties, really the intention and the reason why they were created is they are actually representative of unity because they are unified thought in a way. But in the future, political parties will be representative of unity in diversity. So we will still have different viewpoints on how to solve an issue or solve a problem, but yet still see each other as one. So that's really where we're, need to kind of head. And I'm starting to see a little bit of that. Not perfect, not the perfect example of unity and diversity, but we're starting to see a little bit of, just a modicum of acceptance of the other side. And this is wonderful. This is wonderful. And if you didn't have hope about the future, this should give you a tremendous amount of hope for the future. Because it is where we'll be going, But I love you guys. Thank you very much for the comments, and I look forward to talking to you again in the very near future. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Remember to take action and help SOP save our planet. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again in future videos.